So I'm going to kick off with a few questions. I need to warn you that based on the conversation before lunch, if you've got questions, you're going to have to jump in, because otherwise the four of us may just run all afternoon with no disregard to the audience. So please ask questions, and please interrupt me if I'm saying too much. Can I also just say how much fun it is to be on stage with three such outstanding women. Now, Patricia, to you first. You and I have done some work on some of these issues in the past together before, but you are absolutely passionate about issues of social inclusion and about equality and inequality, equity, inequity. Can you just talk to us briefly about why you think it's so important to our society, and then also what do we need to change to finally actually, in terms of government policy and service delivery, to finally see some improved outcomes?
Well, at the moment, what we're doing is, after 26 years, as you've said, getting much the same outcomes. And so I think we have to conclude that what we're doing at the moment isn't working very well. And that's, part of the problem that I see in the way we do things is that we aren't prepared to step back and say, does this work? And are things improving? And what do we want to see improving? Now, I was one of the unfortunate people that was part of the Australian Social Inclusion Board, and there's few others in the room, where we actually felt that we should be looking to see what it meant to be included in Australian society, and constantly disappointed by the fact that most people, and if we had a function today on economic growth, this room would be filled. But once you start trying to talk about how you distribute the proceeds of economic growth and what it's for, people get much less interested. So I think that we should be talking about what gives people dignity, what makes people feel safe, and are we doing the right things to make people have the dignity that they require? Have they got the dignity of work? Do we hound people who don't have work? Do we lock up kids that aren't doing well? So I think we're asking all the wrong questions, and my view is that our job as economists is to make people have a good life, and I think at the moment we're all about making money.
Yeah, here. I think one of the recommendations we made, obviously I spoke to earlier, was around New Start payments, and you can talk about the gap between the poverty line and where our current New Start payments are in any number of complexions, but it's pretty hard, I think, to live with dignity when you're living on $280 a week, for instance.
Yeah, and that is, I looked it up last night just to make sure that there wasn't someone in the audience who was going to ask me how much a loaf of bread cost. And it is $270 something a week that you've got to live on. And if any of you have got young children, young people, young adult children, you'll know that it's really hard to live on $270 a week. So I think we spend far too much time on trying to prevent somebody from playing the system rather than to try and help people who are trying to make the system work. And you'll find, I've run welfare services all my life now, and most people are not trying to play the system. The vast majority of people are trying to get on, trying to get educated, trying to find a better life, and trying to find the dignity that comes with being included and not excluded from our society. I can go on to policy prescriptions, but let's talk to some of the others.
I'm going to segue straight then across to Alison, because of this issue around place in society, lack of progress. Your area of expertise, of course, is on gender, and at different forums I've spoken about gender pay gaps and all these types of things. Another area where we just seem not to be making the progress that you might expect. What do you think the issue is there?
Well,
the silver bullet, please.
I wish. The enduring gender pay gap is something that Australia should not be proud of. It's a festering sore on our economy. We've got data that shows that, in fact, decreasing a gender pay gap would actually have better, impacts on our economy. But the fact is, it has been enduring. 30 years we've been talking about this, and it's clearly monitored. It remains at 15% at the moment. And it reflects, though, the continual gender segregation of our workplaces, and the fact is that the work that women is the work and industries and occupations in which women are found in are valued less than the work that men are found, and that's got to change. We've got to, and this is where I think, with respect to the issues that are being raised in the report around how how the workforce will change in the future. One of the risks we face is that we will continue. What we will see is a reinforcement and an entrenchment of the inequality, where work that is being created is going to will require the sorts of skills, etc., that have been traditionally valued at higher rates than the work women are found in. And until we see ways of increasing the relative value of the industries and occupations in which women work in, and we see men's representation in those industries and occupations increase as well, we're not going to address the gender pay gap. And I think that's it's a cost to our economy, but it is also the consequences in terms of more poorly paid work histories of women relative to men have consequences for retirement, have consequences across the life cycle. So I think that it's an issue that it's been there. We've had political attention focused on it, wax and wane over the years, and it's got another little highlight now with the high-profile media. Women who have, the BBC and then our own Lisa Wilkinson sort of drawing attention to it. It's gained some attention in that space, but in fact it's across every level of industry and occupation. So I think that has to be addressed more fully by in real ways. And I think the International Women's Day this year, we saw Energy Australia recognise it's got to be paying its women at the same rate it was paying its men. It was quite, for many people that was gobsmacking that a large company was still doing that. The pay difference is there, and so we see a headline that says the gender pay gap's there, and everybody and it's at an abstract level, but at the within businesses, you've got to be looking at it more closely.
I thought the Energy Australia change was really important, because I think a lot of times people sort of questioned if it's real or not. And to have a company that wasn't going to do this without having done the proper analysis, and to have them come out and actually identify it so clearly and actually put a dollar sum next to it, I think made it much more real than some of the other statistics that we see. Now, note to the audience, I'm going to ask one more question, and then if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hands. There are microphones around and someone will come with a microphone, and if you could then identify yourself and where you're from and direct your questions accordingly, that would be most appreciated. Laura, one of the things that we tried to focus on through the report, and we were really keen to do that through your work and others, was around around opportunity. So it's one thing to look at inequality backwards and sort of say, well, these are the outcomes that systems have produced, but how are we thinking about opportunity, and how can we start addressing that so that future trends in inequality don't worsen and we're comfortable with and that we're doing the right things? What do you think is the most important issues that are contributing to educational inequality at the moment, and what are the things that we should be focusing on to try to shift those so that we get better outcomes in the future?
Okay, thank you for that. Listen, I was thrilled that education was part of this report, because it is underpins so many other aspects of society and other aspects of inequality. So it's in a way it's the foundation of all of these things, and so it's important to pay attention to it and to think about how we can improve it. And the inequalities of the outcomes that you mentioned leading up in your talk before lunch, I mean, they're staggering. The difference between a NAPLAN score in year 9 between students from more educated parents and lower educated parents is the equivalent of 4 years of schooling, and this is in year 9. So it's just huge. And then this gets replicated if we look at PISA data. This is an international test that the OECD conducts. And at 15-year-olds, the difference equates to around 3 to 3.5 years of schooling. So again, these are stable measures. They've been replicated in different ways with different students, and they're still finding the same things, and they're absolutely huge. And we might ask, well, why do we care? It's kind of sad, but does it really matter? And the fact is, it does matter. The OECD, again, has said that about 17% of Australian students leave secondary school without having basic skills. Basic. And, this is real. Like, I had a neighbor, a teenage girl, that would babysit my children. And my children at the time were early primary. And after the first time she babysat, my girl said to me, "Mom, we don't think Jasmine knows how to read that well." I'm like, "Why do you say that?" "Well, you asked her if she read a book to us at night, like we always do, because that's what an educated, parent, especially as a PhD, does with their kids, right? You read to your kids every night. And these are picture books for children. We're not talking Shakespeare. And my daughters noticed that Jasmine, who was 16, had difficulty reading some of the words and had to sound some of them out. And this is a girl that's gone to school her whole life, all right? And now she ended up leaving secondary school early, dropping out, had a baby, then entered an abusive relationship, court order against the father, you name it, blah, 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 blah. And so all of these things are intertwined and they're important, and they have implications not just for Jasmine, the babysitter, but also for all of us as a society, because these costs add up. She's more likely to be on welfare. She's more likely then to not be a taxpayer. And my colleague Stephen Lamb at Victoria University has estimated the costs to society of this early school leaving, and they're absolutely staggering. $50 billion, that kind of thing. So it matters. And now the question is, I guess, what can we do about it, and what is the cause of it? And first of all, it's not teachers, so let's just get that off. We talk about how oftentimes politicians like to talk about, oh, we need to have better teachers, and look at what they're doing in Singapore. Well, I have colleagues from Singapore at Murdoch University, and they're the first to tell me it has nothing to do with that, and it has nothing to do with teachers. And my own research that is looked at, and using the PISA data set, we can see that Australian teachers are doing great things. They're doing really well, and they're in some ways doing things better than countries like Singapore or economies like Singapore and China. So it's not teachers. So then the next question is, well, what is it then? And what the OECD says, and what I have said, and I have a piece that's in the conversation this morning that says all of this more succinctly and more eloquently, is that school social segregation is one of the key drivers. So the fact that we have schools in Australia that are segregated by socioeconomic status is the underlying root cause of all of our problems. And therefore, it's the underlying root thing we should be attacking. And just to give you a sense of this, among OECD countries, only 3 other countries have higher levels of segregated schooling than Australia. It's Israel, which has very high income inequality, Chile, which has very high income inequality, and Hungary. And Hungary is a little bit of an oddball, and I want to look at it some more. But they also have differentiated secondary schooling, which means that when you're a secondary student in Hungary, you take a test to get into a gymnasium, an academic school. And if you don't do well on that test, then you go to a vocational school. So in essence, it would be like all schools would be academically selective, or they would be vocational. So that's a different scenario than we have in Australia. So of all those other countries, though, we are the most socially segregated. And I just find it so ironic in a country that is committed to being egalitarian, that has this ethos of the fair go, and of it, as far as we can go, perhaps a classless society. You can hear by my accent, I'm American. So I've been here for 12 years now in Australia. And one of the things I was most struck by when I first came here was how so many people did not go to the local public school, but they were going to different schools. And all of that then leads to the segregated schooling. Now, the next question is, what's the root of the segregated schooling? And that's, I think, a lot to do with funding policy, and it's not just me. It's other researchers, it's economists, and it's peak bodies like the Australian Council for Educational Research, and very many other, and the OECD as well. So we have lots of things, we have policy levers we can use to attack this problem. It's just a matter of now of finding the commitment and the energy and the will to do it.
Well, it's your turn. Questions, anyone? Oh, questions everywhere. Go here first and then here if we could, thank you.
Thank you for the discussion of fascinating research. It's really quite remarkable that we have this feeling that inequality is increasing when actually maybe it's just our awareness. I should say I'm Connie Lenneberg from the Brotherhood of St Lawrence. My question is about one of the other surprising findings about youth, and that the cohort of youth are actually doing better, because the Brotherhood's research and our programs are showing something different. So it's obviously segments of youth, but we've now done a second year of a study of the Hilda data looking at mapping the hotspots of youth unemployment, and it's very location based. And I think one of the most stunning statistics in a 2-year period was the highest rate is outback Queensland, and you'd expect it to be high there. 2 years ago it was about 35%, it's now 65%, so unbelievable growth. But even more alarming, New South Wales has seen, the youth unemployment nationally is 12.2%. New South Wales saw a 1% reduction in 2 years in youth unemployment, but in the Southern Highlands and Shoalhaven, in 2 years it jumped from 19% to 29%. So I'm just wondering if you could reflect on sort of the difference between the overall data that we're seeing about some groups of young people are doing quite well, with the knowledge that other groups of young people are being really excluded, and the place is that key which excludes them from participation.
Yeah, I mean, Peter Whiteford did the chapter for us on the intergenerational inequality, and I think you've highlighted, I think, one of the key themes that comes through so much of the research, which is that when you look at an aggregate level over a period of time, you get one particular story around which you might have a degree of comfort maybe, right? And certainly the presentation that shows that younger people in Australia, particularly compared with what's happening elsewhere, are doing relatively okay is one slice of that story. But I think running throughout the chapters in our report is this theme that when you start breaking it down and looking at particular cohorts, you often get a very different story. And I think that was I think one of the high-level conclusions that flows from this report is that there are pockets of people who are not connected to the prosperity that the broader community is experiencing, and that, as Patricia pointed out, and I'll hand over to others, but just in terms of Peter Whiteford's work, I think it's just that aggregate, but that you then get these flow-on effects, and you end up with this complex scenario of disadvantage, really, and that cuts across so many different characteristics. So that's how I would interpret that finding, is that you look at something from an aggregate perspective, you look at an overall cohort, and yes, you do need to just peel the lid back and have a look at what's going on. And across so many areas, place seems to be so relevant now.
And I'd have to add to that from the research that we've been doing formerly with Tony Vincent, who has unfortunately died since the research started, but over a long period of time there are these pockets of disadvantage, and the Brotherhood's very well aware of them. And we can put out statistics all over the place that say we don't have problems, but unless we're prepared to peel back and have a look at how is everyone doing? Are we as a society that is willing to leave a group of people behind? And in the days of the Social Inclusion Board, the number of people who were truly being left behind was less than 1 million people, a lot of people. but it isn't a hard policy prescription to get into some of those places of disadvantage and to work in a holistic way with the community. Melinda did ask me earlier, what do I think is wrong with policy? I think one of the biggest things that's wrong with policy is that we divide the life of people up into segments, and we'll help them with their housing. We might help them with their education. We might help them with their alcohol abuse. We might help them with something else. I went to a casework meeting. I did the Royal Commission into Family Violence in Victoria a couple of years ago. And during that time, I accompanied a young woman who was suffering family violence. And I went to a meeting one day. She went to hospital and had a baby just before the commission. And she was notified to the Department of Human Services because her partner was beating her and she was a drug addict. And I went to a meeting. And I went to a meeting with 13 people who were helping her. And they were all looking after a little piece of her life. She had a drug counsellor, she had a homelessness worker. The homelessness worker, when she was discharged from hospital, the best response that we could get was 1 or 2 nights in a motel. So I think that some people have to start peeling back and having a look at what true disadvantage is. True disadvantage isn't being between jobs or your mortgage has gone up. True disadvantage is where you can be discharged from hospital with a £5 baby to a motel for 2 nights without anybody knowing what's going to happen to you next. So I think part of the problem is that we're prepared to look at statistics that show what a good story we can tell. Australia can tell the story that it has one of the most targeted welfare systems in the world, so that the people who need help get it. But you can also say we have one of the meanest welfare systems in the world because the people who need help are not getting the holistic assistance that they need. So I think that's the answer, that you can see the statistic, and my son's one of those kids that's doing really well, but you know, other people's children are not doing it all well.
A question over here, I think.
Thank you. Tennant Reid from the Australian Industry Group. My question is particularly for Professor Sheridan, but open to all. On the question of gender wage inequality, what's the relative importance in tackling that of, I guess, degendering categories of employment that are currently gendered, revaluing gendered categories of employment, or increasing equality within those categories? And what are strategies to achieve it? Which of those you think is most important?
Well, I think one of the really stunning and most disappointing findings more recently has been the failure to to early childhood, the relative rewards associated with early childhood education. For 5 years, the unions were putting forward a case of recognising, revaluing that work, and it has failed to this point. What we've looked at in terms of where we've seen significant increases in participation rates of women in the workforce, no doubt about that, but they do tend to be clustered. We've seen in absolute terms the finance sector increase in terms of employment, construction and mining, and over the last 20 years, and from economic, from the process of deregulation of the Australian economy in the 1990s, fostered growth in finance, in mining, in construction, and what we've seen there is that the horizontal segregation continues within those industries, and so women have moved into those industries, but they are not in the most senior levels. So we've seen gender gaps there. But the fact is, women have also been, in absolute terms, increasing their employment in the community services as well, and they remain under the remuneration in those industries in that sector is much lower. So there's both factors operating there. Now, we've seen a lot of work, and I think the Workplace Gender Equality Agency has done a marvellous job. I really am supportive of the processes in which we've seen women's access to management roles really been a feature of, and we track that. We track women's representation in executive roles and on boards. And we've seen change happen in those, but that's to a privileged few. And the ultimately, we've still got inequality across the sorts of work that women are engaged with, and I think that really has to be addressed and recognised. And I think as the changes with technology occur, there's even the fact is women are found in many of the clerical roles that may well disappear through routine, through technology changes. So there's consequences of our changing economy, and I think we need to be conscious of and prepared to address the questions of the valuing of the work, and work that women have done has been undervalued, and we need to address that. Now, that's a big ask, and I think Joan Acker's work, who's an American sociologist who talked about how, the difficulty about this is advantage is hard to give up. And consequently, within actually addressing these processes will require hard decisions. Now, Energy Australia's example is something that should help to, we need to see more of that being modelled, that actually within the organisations, the day-to-day practices that reinforce the differences can be addressed at an organisational level, but the fundamental question of the work that women have done, the work that, in aged care services that will be increasing, is undervalued. I think it's undervalued in early childhood. I think it's undervalued. Aged care is undervalued, and until that's addressed, and who's going to pay for that, are major questions for our economy, and how then we see greater equality in our workplaces.
Questions?
Hannah Pitterman from Deakin University. Thank you so much. I recently listened to Professor Michael Sandor, who was here, and he talks very much about not only a market economy, but a market society that the only value is in society is that can be transacted economically. And there is much that is not counted, but counts. And to your point, women in low-paid employment, women not being paid for all the philanthropic work, for all the care for families, for children, that has no value in a market society at all. So there's some sort of perversion that occurs in a market society. And going back to human rights, I mean, everything has to be economised so that human rights sits on the margin. And I just quickly looked through and I saw Simon Longstaff and his comment about the centrality of the human being and the human condition in society. How can we ensure that that our bias to all things economic is managed in this market society so that the dignity of the human being becomes included in all policy decisions?
I think that it is up to us to do that we have the governments that we deserve, and we do not, as a community, we continue to hold on to the power, the money and so on. We're not prepared to sit down and say, let's redo everything. And the way women are paid is merely a reflection of their position in society. The fact that women are killed by their partners, one a week, is a reflection of the subservient position of women in society. And there are lots of good men who are trying to change that. But we need a much more fundamental look at what we value, because governments do what we ask them to do. And unless we're prepared to say, we actually want a different society, we've done it with healthcare, I've got to say. We're one of the nations in the world that said we don't want people to be ill and unable to afford healthcare. We're going to have a really good universal system, which is a different decision than I think they make in the US, for example. That in the US you'll get really terrific healthcare if you can afford it, but if you can't afford it, you could go broke, basically, trying to get it. So I do think this is the debate that we start having to have, which is about what is it that we value, and how do we then transmit that to economists and to government without turning it into a technical argument about how we measure things. I think that's probably that we have to do it, that we have to change things, that the men in I've got to say, I'm not a fan of male champions for change. I did want to start a movement against them for a while, because I think that that's part of the problem that we hand back. There are a lot of good women in organisations that can be changing things in organisations. I know there are a lot more men, but I just think we've got to start doing things differently, and I think we keep using, and you can use the parameters of the market. I think Pope Francis uses exactly the same thing and criticises the market non-stop. But I think it's just getting back to saying we have to say what we want the society to look like, and I think we don't do that often enough.
Can I just come in with another perspective on that too? And I think consistent with what you're saying, Patricia, I was on a panel recently at the AFR Banking and Wealth conference. And it's interesting in the context of what we're seeing with the Royal Commission and all the rest of it, and a lot of conversation around social licence, which I think is a similar conversation to what you're talking about, which is, how do we think about organisations that have a broader purpose than just delivering profits? But one of the points that I was trying to make in that panel is that as a company director, I've certainly gone out and had plenty of conversations with investors and shareholders. I spend a fair bit of time talking to the ESG, the environmental, social governance people, and of course they ask us questions about these other issues. But to be honest, most of the mainstream sort of investors, when it's not their ESG team, these questions don't come up, right? So when I talk to the CEO about his investor meetings, he doesn't get asked about whether he's hit his gender diversity targets. He doesn't get asked about the gender pay gap. He doesn't get asked about a whole bunch of other things which society is telling us matter in the context of social licence. So I think there are a few points of disconnect where I agree with Patricia. Unless people start talking about it more, and unless people actually start making decisions that reflect the things that they value and which matter. And Alison Watkins, who's the CEO of Coca-Cola, explained it too, in terms of saying these are the issues, there's a whole bunch of long-term issues that she and the board believe they have a real responsibility to address. But she runs up against short-term views from shareholders, and trying to strike the balance in those two things is actually quite difficult. And so those are some of the conversations that I think need to be had as well. More questions? Sorry, here and then.
Afternoon, Harry Bonning from AGL. Do any of the panellists have a view about what type of programs or policies are working effectively in other countries to tackle this problem? Are there some sort of case studies, if you like, of effective policy that helps bridge the gap?
Perhaps can I also just say, I actually think there's examples in Australia, so please feel free to reflect on Australian examples as well if you want.
Well, the policies that I've seen work best are the ones that work at a very local level. Things like neighbourhood renewal that we had in Victoria, Brimbank, Mildura, where they start off saying, we want to work together as a community to bring the people who are falling behind up. And then you get the government departments to pool their money rather than having 25 funding pools and 13 workers. You actually then start saying, can we work together to set objectives for this community, and can we have a plan for the community? That's one way it works. New Zealand have brought in something called the navigators for the very disadvantaged people, and they have people who will actually help navigate the complex systems of government to try and get the assistance. So much more integration of programs. I think, you know, Sacred Heart Mission here in Victoria could talk to you about the work that they've done on bringing very, very disadvantaged people some dignity through a program. Do you want to tell me what the program is called? Journey to Social Inclusion. Right, okay. So
did you hear that? Journey to Social Inclusion, for those who want to go and have a look at it.
So but it does take this holistic view of a person's life, and it actually has to recognise that you don't fix the damage that's being done to people in an instant. So when we had neighbourhood renewal, it was funded for 7 years. So the damage that has been done to people, particularly those that are born into violence, who either violence against children or violence against women, it takes half a lifetime to cure, basically. So I think there are lots of them around, and there are lots of there'll be a lot of people in this room. I know I'm speaking to the converted, who can come and see AGL soon. You were from AGL, is that right? and offer you services. I know AGL has tried to do some work as well and does good work, but partnerships between, Brotherhood's really good at partnerships between corporations and welfare organisations. I'm going to talk about one really quickly and then I'm going to be quiet. Jesuit Social Services, for example, has been working with the National Australia Bank to bring African people into the workforce for 7 years now, and we've had a 90% success rate in getting them jobs. So that it is possible to do it, and the closer you get together with a corporation, the better and more success I feel we have.
Lend-Lease got a fantastic justice reinvestment program in Burke, place-based, community, corporate engagement, another classic example of exactly the things that Patricia was talking about. Laura, did you?
I just wanted to add something, and it gets back a little bit to how I started off my response earlier about education as a preventative measure. So all of these things that we're talking about here, these programs, I mean, they're fantastic and they're necessary and we need them, but at the same time, we should also be trying to work at a preventative level and upfront rather than waiting to try to remedy the situation at the end, because as Patricia said, often it can take decades to do that. And so we need a two-pronged approach. And, you know, just like I gave that example of my neighbor, the neighbor girl that babysat for my children, Jasmine, if she had actually been able to finish her schooling with good skills, she would then be in a situation where she's probably going to have a better chance of getting a good job and making good money and not be disadvantaged. And so then that asks us, well, what can we do then to make sure that that doesn't happen, that we reduce the number of students, number of young people that don't have basic skills? And, you know, other countries, you asked about other countries and other places. So, for example, Scandinavian countries, and, you know, Finland's one of them, they will spend a lot of resources on students that as soon as they start to fall behind, even a little bit, Zoom. Spending some time to come in at focused, targeted intervention, maybe one-on-one, maybe in a small group, to get that child as soon as possible back up to where they're supposed to be. And it's very effective. In Finland, for example, 30% of students receive that intervention at one time or another. So it's a huge number of students. And by doing that, you reduce those inequalities, you increase outcomes, and then that is the prevention that can tackle against disadvantage later on down the track. But all of those things cost money. So, you know, that's another question. How are we going to spend our money in terms of education?
But, you know, the interesting point there too, Laura, is I think one of the big challenges in policy is that you get a focal point where you look at what the cost is now, and there isn't a consideration of the multifaceted costs that end up coming down the track. Yep. Which, you know, of course you need to consider what it costs now, but I think sometimes there isn't that consideration of what you're going to end up paying in the future if you don't actually do it now.
That's right. And so there's that point, and even more than that, I would add to that, is that we can pay for those costs that I'm talking about without increasing the amount of money we spend on education. So it's not a matter of spending more money to get a better output. We need to spend our money differently. we need to distribute the money between schools differently.
Freya.
Thank you, Belinda. Is it on? Freya Marsden, I'm on the board of Brotherhood of St Lawrence and various other Victorian government boards. I wanted to just pick up on what you said, Patricia, and that is that we get the governments that we deserve, which I completely agree with. But I also wanted to note that it's not just individual electorates back to ministers, it's also the policy advisors. So a busy minister will take the advice on balance of what their policy advisors put up. And as Melinda would well know, in designing policy is about a balance. So if you make it too tight, you don't cover all the people that you needed to. If you make it too loose, then you end up with what the situation you were talking about of considering much capturing scammers, basically. Scammers may actually rort the system. What I want to know is what can we do to make sure that our policy advisors, as they're designing their advice, think very carefully about being more generous and making sure that we capture as many people and help as many people as we can, rather than being as concerned about the rorters and the scammers. How do we get that balance right? How do we educate those who are creating policy more effectively?
I'm going to be glib and say we get the policy advisors we deserve as well. It's interesting because this challenged Jesuit social services quite a lot. I mean, I'm a CEDA board member, but I'm also the chairman of Jesuit Social Services. And as you probably know, there was a very large fight in the community last year about whether we should build a new jail to put young people into, rather than the early intervention that was talked about. Wouldn't we be better off to try and spend a lot of money on trying to prevent young people going to prison in the first place? And the evidence is all there that you spend money early and you'll have a much better outcome for young people. So we went all the way to America. A donor paid for us to go to America to find out how they were changing their justice systems, and they are. You know that America is the most incarcerated country in the world, or maybe not in the world, but in the developed world at least. And the only way they were changing things was through a campaign called Black Lives Matter. And again, it goes back to people. Yeah. So finally, it was a very strange union between black people and fiscal conservatives. And fiscal conservatives do not like spending money on things that don't work. And Black Lives Matter was pointing up all the time that the people who were being punished were black people, basically. So the answer is always the same, that unless people get engaged in the political debates, you're going to keep getting people that perpetuate the status quo. So, again, I think I'm past it now because the way in which people do it, the way young people organise is very different. And I think I have great hope for young people and the way that they will organise. You see a lot of really good campaigns being run. But again, it is about people getting off their seats and saying something and doing something. You can all do it in your own workplace. You can call out the person who's being violent to a partner. You can talk about the injustice of a woman not getting a pay rise when a man does. You can all do it, but you have to get up and do something. So I don't know that we can blame, particular classes of people. It's something we all have to tackle.
Can I just add one thing though, Patricia? Yeah. I was really struck by your comment about that the strange coalition, right? So fiscal conservatives, they don't want to spend money on things that don't work. In my view, one of the biggest problems that we have is a lack of transparency around government spending and programs. Now, I'll say this putting a different hat on, which is as co-chair of Reconciliation Australia, and the lack of transparency around what is actually spent on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the effectiveness of those programs allows bad policy to be perpetuated, because it's very difficult to run the argument that the stuff isn't working because no one actually measures it. And so one of the things I think we all need to do is to push for, I'm going to plug a report that I was involved in, the Productivity Commission, data access and use, which also means the government getting their data out and being transparent about what they're spending, how they're measuring it, and whether it's having an impact, because then you can actually go and put the case. And at the moment, it's pretty challenging. Questions? Sorry, I'm sorry, over here.
Sam Gribble from Metricon Homes. My question's about housing and the extent to which that has a root cause in some of the inequality. Historically, housing disadvantage tend to be done in concentrated areas. We hear in earlier questions about concentration of disadvantage. To what extent, and I'm directing this question initially to Patricia, but others may have views, to what extent do you see that concentration of disadvantaged housing as being a major factor? Can it be solved realistically by more integrated housing, and how should governments go about promoting that, or are they promoting it enough today?
Well, no doubt that housing and the location of broadacre and high-rise public housing corresponds very closely to areas of disadvantage. So policy has created areas of disadvantage. There's no doubt about that. The Tony Vincent work will show you that over and over again. Those high-rise towers also became havens for drug dealers. Public housing authorities sold off some of the broadacre estates to make slum landlord areas. So our policies have been wrong. There's no doubt about that. Changing them is a very difficult thing, because public housing was initially designed to be housing for the working poor, and it was meant that you stayed there for a period of time, then you got the opportunity to buy it. You know all of this, so I'm sorry to be looking at you and telling you this. So the question therefore becomes, how do you solve the problem now? I'm a great fan of having much more focus on lead tenant arrangements, so that you can take over, government will guarantee your tenancy in an ordinary suburb. I think that's one of the changes we could make. There are developers around at the moment who will try very hard to try and work to develop estates for low-income people and take only people out of public housing estates. You will find that there are a number of people in public housing estates who could, in the right circumstances, move. But what we ask them to do is to move from where they brought their family up in North Melbourne to go out to Bandywallop North, where there's a new housing estate. So I think that if we thought about people more and what is actually preventing them from moving, because we've done it at JSS once again, we've got 100 people who will come out of public housing into an affordable arrangement if they can do it where we own property, which is in Richmond, Collingwood and those sorts of places. So I think there are solutions that we don't think about. We think a lot about, just building new houses way out where the land's cheap, where there's no work. And I think there are things that you could be doing.
I'm going to take the opportunity just to direct a question to Alison, if I can, which is, I think one of the things, particularly through Patricia's comments and all of the comments really, is just about valuing people. He talked about valuing women's work, but also how I would interpret it, sort of connectedness and inclusion. And one of the things that's interested me, particularly as a board director, is how the conversation around gender seems to be shifting from diversity, which can be about numbers and targets and sometimes quotas, to about people, which is an agenda around inclusion. And so now more people are talking about, strategies to deal with inclusion and inclusiveness rather than diversity targets. I wonder what your views on that are.
Well, I think that is the ultimate aim of, the language around, around inclusion has changed over the years. We started when we were first looking at women's experience in the workplace. It was really then a social justice case for why women should be included. Inclusion is the underlying philosophy. That it hasn't sort of worked when we've talked about social justice. Then we moved to the business case and then it's diversity management. The narratives are changing, but we haven't really seen much. No, I shouldn't say that. In my working life, there has been significant change in women's experiences of the workplace. As an educated woman, I am saying that. I believe I'm a beneficiary of that. But fundamental inclusion around the valuing of women's work has not changed. You know, my work experience has been, in higher education. Well, actually, I started in the meat industry, highly gendered workplace, and I looked around and thought, oh, no senior women in the meat industry. I need to set myself apart. I'll get a PhD, and then and my career will take off. Well, I got the PhD, realised I liked higher education, stayed in that. 30 years later, the meat industry looks no different. There are still no senior women in the meat industry. We haven't seen much change, and yet we've worked, you know, the language has gone from, as I said, the narrative's changed a lot. I think inclusion is the next stage of the discourse around it. But until we address the fundamental changes, and I think we've seen progress with respect to those who are already in privileged positions, I think, and that's good. But we need to focus more attention, I think, on the underlying divisions and segregation in our workforce before we really achieve inclusion. And I think, but we've got to keep vigilant around it, and I think that's something that I've seen over 30 years. You think things are changing and it slips back. So attention, it takes vigilance to keep this argument going and hopefully to see change across those areas in which women's work remains undervalued.
Question over here.
Yeah, thank you. Lee Hardingham. I have the privileged position of being the Social Inclusion Manager on the Westgate Tunnel project for the constructors. It's a position in our organisation or in our project that doesn't usually exist and does on this project because of the size and scale of the project. So one of the challenges that I had when I was actually assisting with the tender writing to actually win the right to be part of the team to deliver it was how we were actually going to meet the expectations of our client, ultimately the state government, on the social inclusion commitments that underpinned, I guess, the values that this project had for the state and Melbourne and Melbourne's West in particular. And one of the things that we realised was that we needed to have a two-pronged approach, right? We needed to have the physical ability to find the people and to bring them into our workforce in a sustainable way. But we also needed to change our own organisation and build the business case, or whatever the language is we want to use now, around that. And what we as a leadership team on that project realised that we were also entering into a very competitive labour market for the highly skilled and educated engineers and construction people that were required to build the project, given the other major infrastructure that's occurring. And one of the things we took as a basis was the fact that people, all of us and others across Australia, want to work for values-based companies. So in fact, social inclusion we took on to be the value that we wanted to bring forward. And so we've used it as a recruitment strategy for our senior people. We've used it as a recruitment strategy for our entry-level people. But to do that, we are constructors. We build roads as bridges, tunnels and all sorts of other major pieces of infrastructure. But we actually needed to have a workforce that had great skills in bringing women into non-traditional roles, bringing people seeking asylum into our workforce, to bring people living with disability and mental illness, to in fact bring people experiencing homelessness into a construction industry that has always been so focused on safety and productivity and on time and on budget. So it's been a wonderful, early stages, but it's been a wonderful experience. But the success was actually recognising that it was a value that we needed to have from the senior project director down through every aspect of what we do every day by every person in our organisation. And what's occurred over the last 6 months is, yes, we've had some wonderful people from those experiences, those barriers to success coming into our workforce. But we've seen a huge change in the mindset, hearts and mindsets of the people that are usually making the decision about who does join our workforce, who is suitable, and what we need to do to actually keep them safe, grow their careers and prepare them for the pipeline of work that's in front of them over the next 20 years in Victoria. So I've heard a lot of that answered in a lot of the questions today, but I'm just interested in your comments about how sustainable you actually believe that process is one project, one person, one initiative at a time, because that's the only way that we see that change can occur.
I would say exactly that it's got to be at that organisational level, that, you know, because at the aggregate level, things, we lose sight of the actual experience. And it's the change process that you're describing there that cumulatively will make a difference to our workplaces. It's at the moment, though, you know, unless it happens within the business, within the organisation, we're not going to see the changes at an aggregate level. It's got to build up from within. That's why I was saying the Energy Australia, and Melinda's point earlier, that's a great example of here is an action that has been taken by an organisation that can then be modelled, you know, it becomes a model for others to learn from. I think it's a wonderful story.
The point I'd make is that Reconciliation Australia has a toolkit called Reconciliation Action Plan, which helps organisations determine how they, through the day-to-day course of their business, can have an impact on reconciliation. One of the things that organisation does is a barometer on reconciliation, where they measure community attitudes across the country towards issues of reconciliation around trust, the relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and things like that. But Reconciliation Australia also does a barometer that looks just at organisations that have reconciliation action plans. And the thing that you discover when you look at those two groups is that organisations that have a RAP, as we call it, the attitudes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the strength of the relationship, the measured trust, they're off the chart compared to other companies. Right? So what that tells you is the sorts of things that you're talking about actually changes the individual people in those organisations, and it changes them permanently because it causes them to have different behaviours, different relationships, and to change their own thinking. So that's something that a particular project, a company doing that, a not-for-profit rolling that sort of program through their organisation, where they're tackling all of the issues that everyone on the panel has spoken about today, actually rolls forward, and they take that home and they have conversations with the people around them. So again, it sort of comes back to the theme. I think the biggest challenge for us is we start off with this big aggregate challenge. We look at the data, we look at the aggregate information, and then we start taking a step back and looking through the different lenses. We haven't spoken at all about inequality in respect of disability, but it's another area where Australia does poorly in terms of the workforce participation of people with disabilities. And the challenge is that you have to do this one step at a time, one organisation at a time, one person at a time, but somehow we need to have the means to actually communicate the collective impact of that. And that the different ways of doing things do matter. And to me, that's why having these conversations, doing the sorts of work that we've done through these chapters is actually so important. The other thing too I'd note is that in Indigenous employment, the thing that really makes the difference is when CEOs appoint the right people to the job. So congratulations to your organisation. Any other questions? Are we out of time? Yeah, we're out of time. Mm-hmm. I told you we'd talk all day if we could. Well, I think it's been a tremendous conversation. Can you all please join me in thanking our wonderful panellists today?